Welcome to the MIT Leadership Center video series. My name is Hal Gregersen. I am the Executive Director of the Leadership Center. Today we're honored to have Deval Patrick with us. He's the former governor of the state of Massachusetts, and he's also currently a managing partner at Bain Capital. Deval, glad to have you with us.
Thank you, Hal. Great to be with you.
It is good. And I'm deeply curious, we're deeply curious about your leadership story, honestly. And if you were to think of a couple of things in your history as a leader that define you uniquely, that it's a bit of your signature, what would those one or two things be?
I'm a risk taker, a calculated risk taker, and I think that having the confidence of being able to figure it out is, for me, a pretty important part of my leadership style. Is one of the reasons why I've tried so many different kinds of leadership in the course of my career, and so many different kinds of settings, I guess is how I would put it. And as I've reflected on that over the years, I think I know what the source of that is.
Really? You took the question out of my mouth. Where did that start?
Well, I had two relatively early, meaning early in life experiences, which I think affected me in terms of building that sense of confidence that I could sort it out. One was coming to Milton Academy at age 14. From the south side of Chicago, never having seen any place like it and feeling like I was landing on a different planet. You know, they had a dress code in those days. The boys wore jackets and ties to classes, so my grandparents splurged on a new jacket for me to wear to class, but a jacket on the south side of Chicago was a windbreaker. So the first day of class, all the other boys are putting on their blue blazers and their tweed coats, and I had my windbreakers. So I had a lot to figure out. And then I had a great experience there in the end, but as I said, a lot to figure out, and I then went on to Harvard for college, the first in my family to do so. And after college, I had an experience living in Darfur, working with the UN for most of a year. It was the first time I'd ever been out of the United States. I had a traveling fellowship. I landed in Cairo and hitchhiked to Khartoum, and then arrived in Khartoum and learned that the person I'd been writing to for months about my coming had left the week before for 2 years in Long Beach, California. And I had to work my way onto the project and figure it out, and basically they sent me to Darfur to get rid of me, which at the time, though peaceful, was as remote as I'd ever been. No phone service, no mail service, no airport or train. It's just tracked through the sand for 600 miles. And out there, you know, I learned the language, I made friends, I figured it out. And I think experiences like that have taught me that your capacity for figuring it out, particularly if you're open to the help that other people want to give you, is quite a bit broader than you might think.
Those are two very different experiences. In one sense, it's moving from one community to another within a country context, but very different contexts. And the other is going to a completely different country, culture, context. Some of the research we've done behind a book that I've written called The Innovators' DNA, we discovered that people who have lived in two or more cultures for long enough to get a depth experience in them, they actually have twice the probability of getting an innovative idea that's valuable.
Okay.
And so, you know, you go back to that experience.
That makes sense to me, by the way.
That's my curiosity. You go back to that experience you had in Darfur where we summarized that in 60 seconds. But my guess would be there were moments where you didn't know what you didn't know.
Right.
And it's like, what do I do here? How did you approach this?
Well, you know, there are all kinds of levels of isolation that that came with that experience. You know, not just being so far away from everyone I knew and having no way to connect with them. I mean, in those days there were no such things as cell phones or the internet. So I was completely cut off. By the way, if my kids tried something like this today, I'd kill them. But the language was its own isolation. There was no one, I mean, the person I worked with was a Sudanese who spoke about my age, who spoke about as much English as I did Arabic. So we were figuring that out together, and our relationship and the people we were dealing with in the souk, in the marketplace every day, in many cases had never seen an American before, at least not one who wasn't on a screen somewhere. Right. And I think, understanding your, and developing your ability to make friends, to build relationships across differences. How important it is for you to listen, and listen carefully, and listen for the nonverbal signs and signals that people send, because the verbal ones aren't, when you're dealing in a different language, aren't always helpful. Until I became conversational in the language, that was enormously important. And so I think for me, one of the many takeaways was about how powerful listening is, how much it conveys respect, how much it enables meaningful relationships where people are forthcoming, how much it invites people to help you and to teach you. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And all those things contribute to success.
It's interesting. I bumped into Marc Benioff, the founder of Salesforce.com, at the World Economic Forum Davos meetings, and I was talking with Marc about how does he figure out the right questions, and he looked me right in the eye. He's about my height. He looked me right in the eye. He said one word: listen. And then he waited to see how I was listening.
Right.
And I'm thinking of that as I listen to you talk about listening. And my question is, are there practices you engage in, are there things you do that help you listen with more than your ears? Because you're talking about more than the ears, and even more than the eyes, I think.
Right. I'd probably be too grand to make it sound like I have actual disciplines, but I think one thing I notice is how we all seem to feel like we have to fill up the space between our comments, and that we can't, you have to be quick, you have to be, responsiveness isn't always verbal. Sometimes it's just taking the time, waiting a beat or two. The other thing I found is that when you're trying to get people to tell you things that they are reluctant to tell you, from levels of intimacy you're trying to build with members of your family or friends, or frankly even the people you work with who are having a real tough time telling the boss that something isn't going well, if you wait a beat or two, it's like they take a deep breath and then they go ahead. And I've learned layers of valuable information that way, as a human being and as a leader.
Thank you. One of the things that at least I've noticed with very senior leaders, be they corporate leaders or government leaders, it's easy to get insulated. It's easy to get isolated.
Right.
And the kind of listening you're talking about, I think is a way of approaching the world that very senior positions almost sometimes systematically keep us from doing.
I hear that. I mean, there's a kind of a bubble, certainly around governors, and I think around executive leaders too, and and business leaders.
It's not just government. It's
But I would say that the listening, maybe one way of thinking about active listening in that kind of context is how important it is for you to put yourself in the way of people who might not normally have access to you. When I was an executive in business, we were frequently talking with the other people in the C-suite. There were 5 of us who were the most senior people at the 2 Fortune 50 companies I worked in, and we spent a lot of time with each other. And I started bringing in more junior people to work in my office on a kind of a rotation, essentially so I would have another perspective from outside the C-suite. As governor, one thing I did notice is that I was out a lot on purpose, and very different from my predecessors. So my security detail was having to get used to that. I didn't come in the back door and then go along a rope to the podium and do my thing and then go out the back door again. I would engage with people, and whether it was at an event or in the grocery store or at Home Depot, I noticed how that people would, they'd see you, they kind of do a double take. You could see them processing the question, is that the governor? Yeah. And they almost always came up and said something. Sometimes it was a compliment, sometimes it was a criticism, but more often than not, it was a very brief insight into the way they live their lives. They were processing. I got to say something to I've got the governor's attention. I'm gonna say my piece, if that's what it is. If you're listening, you learn things. You learn things that influence how you think about policy, about how you think about what's working and what's not, because you're listening, of course, across multiple conversations over periods of time, and so you begin to understand what the consensus points are. It's very, very helpful, very helpful, at least for a governor like me who believes that policy matters where it touches people.
Yeah. And part of that listening process is undoubtedly figuring out what's the right question for the situation. Yeah. Because obviously the questions guide the kind of data and answers and insights that we get. Do you think about that? Do you reflect on the kinds of questions you ask?
I do in certain situations, but in some of the ones in my political life that I was just describing, I think this is back to the point of being quiet and letting the person who wants to tell you something fill that space. Let them set the agenda. I've been in lots of situations, we both have, of course, where the conversation is much more purposeful, and you have to ask the question to guide the conversation, or you have to ask the extra question to actually get at an answer. And I think it's also enormously important, at least again for me, to ask enough questions to be sure that the person knows I am listening for an answer and not a response. So
what's the difference?
So I think sometimes, and this, I used to think this was true mainly of politics, but it's certainly true in large companies too, and that is the filibuster, where you ask the question, the person just fills up the space. They just keep talking and talking, and sometimes it's to demonstrate how smart or well informed they are. And sometimes it's to avoid answering the question. And frequently, when you are as fortunate as I have been to work around really, really smart people, they are telling you things that are useful to know. They're helpful. And they could, if you weren't focused, take you off onto their tangent. But I ask a question because I want the answer. And I also want people to know that if they don't have the answer, I'd rather have them say, I don't know, than to make it up. I had a great 9th grade English teacher who just drove that point home. And he'd ask about a passage in the text, and if we just started going on and on and on, he had 2 things he would do. First, he would raise his fingers like this, which was his sign of the horns of a bull to indicate what he thought about your answer. But if it was a point in the text we should have known, not an interpretation, and we should know it, and we were making up an answer, he would say, stop, have a stand, turn, face the class, small class, and his name was Mr. Smith, and say out loud, I am ignorant, Mr. Smith. And his point was, until you acknowledge what you don't know, then you can't learn what you need to know. I think it's a pretty powerful lesson.
Oh, that's a great story. It reminds me, in some work that Clayton Christensen over at Harvard and I are doing around how do you ask the right questions, we talked with Stuart Brand, who was one of the key people in the whole internet starting up process. And Stuart Brand told us that every day he wakes up wondering how many things he's dead wrong about, which I think is the spirit of what you're describing. It's like, what am I missing here?
Yeah.
What am I not paying attention to? What have I,
That combination of his kind of brilliance and humility is pretty powerful.
Yeah. Your mother, if you don't mind, was she a listener? Did she pause?
She was a listener.
The power of the pause is really important here.
Yes.
You're talking, you've said several times, it's that space, it's that quietness, it's that, I'm not going to fill it, I'm here, I'm attentive.
My mother was not a very communicative person.
Quiet.
And very quiet. I know she was a listener because I know she was absorbing all the time.
Yeah.
She was present, but not. She didn't make you feel engaged. Incredible woman with a lot on her mind, and a lot she was worried about, trying to raise 2 kids on her own,
Exactly.
and on welfare for some of that time, and at a time when in the 50s and the 60s when the experience and the expectations of African American kids was changing, and she wanted us to think big and to be ambitious, but not to be hurt. And by the way, that is a timeless anxiety of parenting, right? The notion that we don't want our kids to be hurt, but we also understand that they're not really going to learn the lessons they need until they get out there and risk being hurt, right?
Like you did when you were young.
Right. But I think she was a good listener, and I say that mainly because of the ways that over a long life she played back things that just astonished me.
You thought she wasn't paying attention.
Exactly.
No, I know you have some children, and someday you may have grandchildren.
We have a grandson.
Really?
Yes, we do.
That's
extraordinary.
fantastic.
He'll be 2 in 2 weeks.
That's great.
Yeah, it's the best.
And if you think of
Makes
that,
you wonder why you didn't just skip the kids and go right to the grandkids.
That's right. That's my wife's view. Grandkids are the gift we have for raising teenagers.
Indeed.
You think about even your own close children, grandchildren, and obviously you care about more than that. It's a bigger story. I think it's part of why you're involved at Bain Capital with social innovation and bigger impact and those things. If you were to gift a particular skill or attribute around leadership to those young children, what would that be?
I think a critical part of leadership, frequently missing in business and in government in America today, is stewardship. The notion that we are supposed to do what we can to leave things better for the next generation, not just the next quarter, not just the next election cycle, but the next generation. It's a very old-fashioned idea, Hal. It's something every single one of us learned from our grandparents. And it's a bad habit in American business, and it's become a bad habit in American politics. And I'm worried about that. And I think when you are about stewardship or generational responsibility, it does make you think about the impact of your actions on others. I grew up in a community on the south side of Chicago that in the 50s and 60s was an old-fashioned community in the sense that every child was under the jurisdiction of every single adult on the block. Right? You messed up down the street in front of Ms. Jones, and she would straighten you out as if you were her own, right? And then call home, so you got it 2 times. And I think what those adults were trying to get across to us was that they had a stake in us, that membership in a community is understanding the stake you have in your neighbor's dreams and struggles as well as your own. And I feel quite confident actually that our children, and quite proud of the fact, our children understand this, and they make the choices they can within their own lives that reflect they understand that. And I think that our grandson will understand that too by virtue of the extraordinary parenting he's getting.
Wow. One last question. It's a comment and then a question. It's related, I think. It comes back to the listening piece. It comes back to that building the capacity to pause. And there's data around the US, for example, if you go into a typical school setting, the average child between the ages of 6 and 18 asks one question per month, per hour in class.
Yeah.
The average teacher asks 50 to 100 questions per hour. And I'm the teacher, I ask you a question, I give you 1 second to answer.
Right.
So,
Right.
and if you don't get that, I'll follow up. Second
Right.
question, you
Right.
get a half a second to
Yeah.
answer. And so I think children often learn young that answers matter a lot more than questions. And I'm coming back to your stewardship comment. I think when people stop asking questions, they disengage with the world, and the stewardship disappears. And so, you know, were there people in your life as you were growing up that helped keep your questions alive? And I suspect that's part of why you feel this deep sense of stewardship.
It's so interesting you say. I had adults, mostly in those classrooms on the south side of Chicago, you know, broken and overcrowded as they were, but great, great teachers who were inviting us to ask questions. And I remember I had a 6th grade teacher I absolutely loved, Mrs. Quaintance. So imagine 35 kids in this classroom. We're all, you know, from just all kinds of broken environments and so forth, neighborhoods, families, and what have you. She taught us to count and say the greetings in German. She took us to the first opera I'd ever seen. I had no idea what they were singing about. I still don't know what they're singing about, but I loved it and still do today. She took us to a new movie that was out at the time called The Sound of Music. And she used it to teach us about the rise of the Nazis and modern European history. She was the first person who encouraged us to imagine what it might be like to be a citizen of the world. Now, that isn't something you learn by rote. It's not a Q&A. It's although there is Q&A in it, it's encouraging you to paint your own mental picture of what that might be like and place yourself in it. That's a huge gift. That is a huge gift. And in order to do that, you have to allow a little room for the questions to come from the classroom.
That's right.
Rather than just from the teacher. And she did.
What a gift.
An incredible woman. Incredible woman.
It's an amazing journey.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And I'm very, very much appreciative of your time.
My pleasure.